Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Ron Karsten with the Portland Lodge of the Theosophical Society in America, and today we have a pleasure to listen to someone who has been a student of religion and spiritual traditions all of her life. When she discovered Buddhism in 1994, she began to understand the meaning of life and the way that we are manifest here in this universe, in this time and space, and how the phenomena exist. We were just speaking about her recent discovery of another influential writer, and I'm sure she'll discuss it today, but she doesn't quit studying. That's what I love about her. She's totally immersed. Oh, and anyway, this is going to be a good speech. She's going to talk about some things that we don't often actually discuss because we're not yet even aware of the fact that some of this is here. So without any further ado, I'm going to introduce you to Clare Goldsberry out of Phoenix, Arizona. So Clare, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you, Ron.
You're
It's
welcome.
good to see everybody here, and thank you for attending the meeting. It was actually in a theosophical meeting here in Phoenix, probably 20 years ago, that one of the members mentioned about Jesus being in India, and I had never heard that before. I was raised Christian, Protestant, and had never heard that before. And that little mention kind of kicked off my interest because I've always believed that there is more that we do not know than we know. And this is true for everything, whether it's religion, whether it's science, everything. There's always more that we do not know than what we do know. And so I began studying it and came across, obviously, several books. We talked about a couple months ago, we did the class on the missing years of Jesus. And this was about his childhood. And there were a number of books written about his childhood, particularly, they weren't the Gospels, but they were written by some of the disciples that knew of Jesus' childhood. And so we're kind of picking up where that left off. And when he was 13 and had his bar mitzvah in Jerusalem, and then as the story goes, in a book called The Life of Saint Issa, that can be found online. And I think I've sent over the link, but if I haven't, I can resend it. It's in a website called thereluctantmessenger.com. And it's called The Life of Saint Issa. Issa is the Sanskrit word for Jesus. And it was interesting that several years ago, when I belonged to a LinkedIn group called Spirituality and Religion, that a gentleman from India, Rajendra Mehrotra, when I brought the subject up of Jesus in India, and he said, well, you know, it's well known in India that Jesus spent at least 10, 12 years maybe in India, maybe 15, when he went to India via the trade route with a merchant from Jerusalem to India. It was there that he studied with a group of Hindu gurus. The problem with the Hindu gurus, he found, was they didn't really have affinity for all people. You know, there is a caste system in Hinduism, and supposedly Jesus was not really into the caste system. He actually believed that people should love everyone and not have a caste system. There's an interesting, it's a little book. I'll hold it up. You can probably see it. It's called The Aquarian Gospel of Jesus the Christ. It's quite extensive. It was written by, channeled actually, by Reverend Levi Dowling. He was a pastor of the Disciples of Christ Christian Church. And what got me so interested in this is I was raised in the Disciples of Christ Christian Church. And of course, I never heard anything like this. Of course, you know, they like to keep everything a secret. You know, mainstream religions, they don't want you to know anything about this because, you know, that might, you know, well, that's not for you to know. You shouldn't know. And between the book on the life of Saint Issa, which you can print out, it's I think it's about 30 pages if you print the whole thing out. And it came from, and the life of Saint Issa actually came from Nicholas Roerich, who was a doctor. He was a Russian doctor, and he was traveling around. People were just fascinated with Tibet and the Himalayas and northern India, as was Nicholas Roerich. Nicholas Roerich actually was shown the same manuscript that Nicholas Notovich saw, and realized that Jesus did spend much of his younger life in India. And so we have this, we have the life of Saint Issa, we have the channeled book, the Aquarian Gospel, and we have actually pretty much proof that Jesus did spend time in India. And you wonder how this whole thing got started. I recently read 2 books on Ashoka. Now, Ashoka was a king in 262, early 260s, 260 to 300 before the Common Era. And Ashoka was a king who adopted Buddhism and wrote on his pillars. The pillars of Ashoka, or the rock edicts. Amazing stuff. There's a new book out on Ashoka, which got me. I read the older book first by another writer, and then I bought the new book on Ashoka. Blavatsky mentions Ashoka quite often in the Secret Doctrine, because Ashoka was actually a person who converted to Buddhism, and even though he was a king, and he was a king for about 32 years, and he promoted Buddhism among he was in the northern part of India, and he promoted Buddhism among his people. He believed that it was one of the best ways to live. And when you wonder, well, how, everybody thinks, okay, India, did anybody travel there? Well, of course, obviously, we have the Alexander the Great. Sometimes my brain takes a crap here. The Alexander the Great, who actually went into northern India. They went to Afghanistan. There was in the caves of Afghanistan. Excellent new book that came out just a few years ago about the Buddhist text of Gandhara, and that was in Gandhara, Afghanistan. And of course, obviously, Afghanistan is mostly Muslim now. But in the early years, it was basically a Buddhist area. Alexander the Great went in there, and he really converted a lot of people to the ways of the Middle East. The Greeks were there, and so the 2 languages that Ashoka used in writing his rock edicts and his pillar edicts, which were pillars that actually were not found until the British archaeologists began exploring in the late 1700s, early 1800s. They actually found these rock edicts and these pillar edicts that Ashoka had written, and it was about Buddhism. Many of these edicts were written in Greek and the language of Jesus. Somebody remind me here. Starts with an A. What is that, Ron?
Ask Ted. Ted's a fireball on this.
Aramaic.
Aramaic. I got Aramaic. Yes, they were actually written in Greek and Aramaic, and so you think, okay, how did Greek and Aramaic get into India? Because I think we have this mistaken idea that nobody traveled. The Middle East stayed in the Middle East. And other than, say, Genghis Khan, who came down, from Mongolia and invaded all these countries, clear to, the Middle East, or you had Alexander the Great, who moved into through the Middle East and then through Afghanistan and northern India. And we think, but did they really travel? Yes, they did. There's another reason that we do believe that that Jesus would have been a common figure in India is because there is some proof that in Kashmir, and we'll see the connection between this pretty soon, there's a connection between Kashmir and the Jewish tribes of Israel. There is a lot of studies have been done. There's even been some DNA testing done that shows that there is Jewish blood among the Kashmiri people in northern India. And so we see this connection that maybe part of the 12 tribes, you know, all but 2 of the tribes were, they call them the lost tribes because they went other places. Nobody knew where they went. But there is speculation and now even some scientific proof that these tribes actually, at least one of them, maybe more, ended up in northern India, in the Kashmir region of northern India. So we do have a connection between the Middle East, where Jesus was born and where he spent his younger childhood, and India, where he went after his bar mitzvah and spent his young teenage years and young adult years in that region of that country. So it's not so odd. You know, people think it's odd, but you know, well, Jesus, you know, he didn't go anywhere. He, you know, and yet we do have information, including the manuscripts that Nicholas Notovich saw when he actually broke his leg when he was trying to leave the Himalayas. And so they took him back into Tibet to stay at a monastery while his leg was healing. And that's when he was shown this text, The Life of Saint Issa. And then Nicholas Roerich also saw it. The Roerichs did a lot of travel through Afghanistan, northern India. Nicholas Roerich, you know, a lot of his paintings, his famous paintings, were of the Himalayas. Mm-hmm. And that new book that's out, I'll send Ron the link to the book, the title and everything, so that you can look at it, because it's amazing. I was just amazed. You just don't imagine people traveling, you know, back in the day when people walked everywhere, or they rode horses, or they had carts. And you think, how could you go 1,000 miles walking or on horseback or cart? And they did. And the things they found were just amazing. They knew more then than we do today. I'm sure of it. So we have these connections. And so people go, well, why did Jesus go to India? Well, if the Jewish people, if there were already the tribes, maybe 1, 2, 3, or 4, had gone into India when the tribes dispersed and then went to different areas, then naturally there would have been a connection there between Jesus and these tribes that were there. There would have been that Jewish connection. Obviously, Jesus would have known maybe of that. And that's why northern India fascinated him so much. There's an interesting paper called Kashmir's Jewish Connection. And it says that the centuries-old myth about the lost tribes of Israel had a strong Kashmiri angle, and it led to countless papers from the time they were exiled in 722 before the Common Era. It was believed they traveled to Kashmir, taking the historic Silk Route. I mean, we know that the Silk Route or the spice roads were very, very well traveled back and forth from China through India, through the Middle East, especially through Afghanistan. Afghanistan has an amazing history. You know, we think of Afghanistan as this, you know, crummy place, you know, like, yeah, Russia was there for 10 years. We were there for 20 years, everybody fighting. But when you look back and see the history of Afghanistan, the Buddhist history, those big Buddhist statues carved in that rock wall called the Buddhas of Bamyan, which of course the Muslims blew up a few years ago. And you see that there was really an interest in that whole region of the world. And it said that the research paper is called A Genome-Wide Search for Greek and Jewish Admixture in the Kashmiri Population. And this was actually before I had read the books on Ashoka and found out that there were many, many texts, particularly on the rock edicts and the pillar edicts, that were written in Greek and Aramaic. So obviously, if it's written in Greek, there were people there that could read Greek and Aramaic. And so there was a big connection there. So, Jesus was not some obscure individual in a small place, Jerusalem. He traveled, as did so many other people. They've done some genetic studies of these, particularly at the University of Utah School of Medicine in Salt Lake City. And they kind of had some mixed results. The paper focused on this long-standing hypothesis that the Kashmiri population actually derived its ancestry from both Jewish people and Greek sources. And so various studies over the years in the last more than 2 centuries claim that there is a historical and archaeology evidence of the ancient Greek presence in India and Kashmir. And it also proposed that many of the rural tribes in Kashmir are descendants from the Greeks as a result of the conquests of Alexander the Great. This paper says it is thought that many of Alexander's conscripts and soldiers settled in parts of India, including Kashmir, and intermixed with the local population once his conquests ended in India. This hypothesis has been supported by archaeological evidence of ancient Greek presence in Kashmir. So there's even been a lot of other studies that do that connection, that make that connection between the Greeks and the Jewish tribes with the Kashmiri people. DNA has been done. DNA has had kind of mixed results. They're not sure that all the DNA is of Jewish or Greek ancestry, but it does show that they definitely have, through their DNA, a connection between the Jewish peoples as well as the Greeks. They say it's possible that the Southern European and Mediterranean admixture seen in the Kashmiri individuals represents a Greek or Sephardic Jewish ancestry. However, these patterns are not Kashmiri specific, but seen in a number of nearby Indo-European populations in northern India and Pakistan. Taken together, these findings strongly suggest that the Kashmiri population is genetically similar to nearby populations and does not have a distinctly different ancestral origin. So when you really start looking back and you're wondering, well, how did all this happen? And you realize people really did travel. And when people say, well, the 12 tribes of Israel, 10 tribes, the lost 10 tribes, we don't know where they went. They obviously went somewhere. And it's likely that northern India, through Afghanistan, northern India, and even into China, probably contains information that shows us that these people did live there. They traveled there. Let's see. Okay, so we kind of make that connection now. You can see that the Jewish people, so were there, and that Jesus, obviously, being a part of the Jewish community, he had his problems with the Jewish rules and rituals and so forth when he came back. But Jesus would have actually had this connection with the Jews in northern India, and perhaps that's where he went ultimately. He had first started out more in southern India, southeastern India, and then did not like what the Hindu Brahmins were teaching him. And so he went to northern India, where he met the Buddhists, and the things they taught were more amenable to his way of thinking. Okay. There is a book called Jesus in India, and I'll send Ron the information about that as well. And the book is actually called Jesus in India, and it was compiled in 1899 and was partly serialized in the Review of Religions in 1902 and 1903, and published in book form shortly after the author's death. It's actually written by an Indian gentleman who knew of the mythology surrounding Jesus in India. The treatise in the book suggests that Jesus, and this was, let's see, I'm going to start this, switch over this, because this takes up after his death. On Jesus' way back, and we didn't talk about this after Jesus, his childhood in Jerusalem, when he was raised as a child. We took to stop at that point. On his way back from India, and they figured he'd spent maybe 10, 12, 13 years in India. On his way back, he actually, in going through Persia, there was an attempt on his life. And he often, and he survived that. He was warned to get out of Persia because there was an attempt on his life. But in India, some of the things he learned about healing. He learned about the healing arts. He was taught how to control the spirits of the air, the fire, the water, and the earth. And he was explained to him how the secret doctrine of forgiveness and the blotting out of sins. That's kind of interesting, coming from a teacher in northern India, teaching him about how to control air, fire, water, the earth, and about it's called the secret doctrine of forgiveness and the blotting out of sins. So we can kind of see that Jesus perhaps learned a lot about his own purpose in life through the teachers that he came across in northern India. He was told that all things result from natural law. And he was also taught that things, just interesting kinds of things that we see Jesus teaching in the New Testament, that we are not rich by what we get and hold. The only things we keep are those we give away. Jesus taught a lot about richness and the rich man and the kingdom of heaven. The rich man said, "How do I get to the kingdom of heaven?" And he said, "Give all that you have to the poor, and thou shalt enter the kingdom of heaven." And so we can see a lot of the things that Jesus taught in the New Testament have very similar meanings to what he was taught in India. And so when people say, well, yes, Jesus taught something totally different, and he did. He did not teach Judaism. In fact, Jesus actually, when he came back and was staying came back to Jerusalem and staying there, he taught things that were totally not understood by the Jewish people. And in fact, we can say that the things that Jesus taught were very, very opposed to Judaism. And of course, we know that's one of the reasons that the Jewish people, that the scribes and the Pharisees went after Jesus to kill him. Did anybody read that new law? There's a new law that was just in, that if you mention, say on social media or whatever, if you mention the fact that Jesus was killed by Jews, you can be disbarred from your social media. That's against speech. It's against free speech. You can't say that the Jews killed Jesus. So I think it's kind of interesting the way, even in our country, where we're supposedly having freedom of speech and freedom of religion, and we know biblically that it was the Jews that killed Jesus, and yet we're not allowed to say that on social media. I don't know if anybody's read that or not, but I was kind of surprised about that for sure. In this little book, The Aquarian Gospel of Jesus the Christ, it mentions that before he returned completely to Jerusalem, he spent from the time he was 24 until the time he was 30, after he got back from India, he said he spent he entered Persia. He entered Persia, and that's where they tried to kill him. He also eventually went into Egypt, and his trip into Egypt was rather interesting. He joined the Egyptian Brotherhood, and you can read about that in this little book. After he left Persia, he went to Assyria and then into Egypt. He joined the Egyptian Brotherhood. He also went into Greece, where he joined, where he educated himself in Greek philosophy that they said was full of pungent truth. And Jesus longed to study with the masters in the schools of Greece. So he really studied everywhere. We think that, that's the problem with these, 17 years of the missing life of Jesus after his bar mitzvah. That's the problem with that. People just go, well, we don't know what he did. So, I guess he lived somewhere. Somebody goes, well, he helped his father build houses, because he was a carpenter, that kind of thing. And yet he did a lot. He did a whole lot of traveling. He learned. We wonder why we're told that we should learn things and know this stuff, because it gives you not only knowledge, but gives you wisdom. And so when he was in Greece, Jesus actually taught the Greek philosophers. Said Jesus brought to them a wisdom greater far than their own. And so he taught. Once in the amphitheater he stood, and when Apollo bade him to speak, he said, Athenian masters, hear, in ages long ago, men wise in nature's laws sought out and found the place on which your city stands. Full well you know that there are parts of earth where it is great beating heart throws heavenward etheric waves that meet the ethers from above, where spirit light and understanding like the stars of night shine forth. Of all the parts of earth, there is no place more than sensitized, more truly than spirit blessed, than that where Athens stands. Yea, all of Greece is blessed. No other land has been the homeland of such mighty men of thought as grace your scrolls of fame. And so we can understand that a lot of, we read a lot of the Greek philosophers. And we said, well, a lot of what the Greek philosophers taught sound a lot like Buddhism, sound a lot like, what Jesus taught. And we can see these threads that run through. You can see all these threads. You can see threads of Buddhism in Plato's Shadows on the Cave Wall. You can see, so we know that things just didn't stay isolated in little parts of the world. They didn't just stay isolated in northern India or isolated in Afghanistan or in Persia or in Egypt or Greece. But these things had these threads that ran through. And what Jesus taught, everybody said, well, what Jesus taught was brand new because the Jews didn't teach those things. Where did Jesus learn it? And then who taught Jesus? And so we see that Jesus taught a lot of things that were similar to Buddhist teachings, Hindu teachings, even to what Plato taught, Aristotle. And the more you read philosophy, and if you look at the various religions, especially, Christianity, for Christians to read what Jesus taught and think that was something brand new and something that had never been taught before is totally wrong, because a lot of those teachings were being given out long before Jesus was born. And we now have history of that. If you ever get a chance to read it's a really cool book, now I can't remember the name. Oh, it's so good. I'll send Ron a whole bunch of theories about it. But it's the Buddha and the Sahibs. And it's really good. It's by a British author. I've been reading a lot of the old books that Blavatsky refers to. I found that looking up all the names of people that Blavatsky read and texts that she refers to, and she refers to many. If you start looking up all the people that she makes reference to, the scientists, the philosophers, all the people that she makes reference to, you start seeing all these connections. And it's fascinating. It sheds a whole new light on what people knew back then. Believe me, they were far smarter than we are today. It's just amazing what has been taught to these people. So Jesus spent his time in Greece. He spent time then in Egypt. We obviously don't have time to go into all of this, but in Egypt, he joined the Egyptian Brotherhood. Now we taught, you've heard about the Brotherhood of Luxor. People, Blavatsky talked about that. And while in Egypt, Jesus said, "In every way of earth life, I would walk. In every hall of learning, I would sit. The heights that any man has gained, these I would gain." So he tried to learn everything he could. Whether it was in India from the Hindus and the Buddhists, or in Persia or Greece, the Greek philosophers, whatever. He tried to learn all of this. In every way of earth life, I would walk. And he certainly did do a lot of studying and walking through earth life in every hall of learning. And it reminds me so much of what Blavatsky did. I mean, she just didn't study one thing. I mean, oh my goodness, you start reading The Secret Doctrine and Isis Unveiled, and you realize this woman, she studied everything. She learned everything. And it fascinates me. And that's how I started studying science and philosophy. And this idea of learning everything you can. It certainly would be what Blavatsky would want of us, is to learn everything we can. He talked about taking the secret vow of brotherhood, and he took the secret vow of the brotherhood, of the Egyptian brotherhood. And he said, "The greatest heights are gained by those who reach the greatest depths, and you shall reach the greatest depths." The more we know, the more we learn, the more wisdom we gain, the more we're led to understanding what life is. And so, to connect Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity, Gnosticism, there's a lot of Jesus teachings in Gnosticism and Buddhism. There's a lot of teachings in Kabbalah and Buddhism. And Jesus received from the Hierophants his mystic name and number. Kind of interesting. There's a lot of secret societies that give you a secret name and a number. Names and numbers were very important. Even in the Mormon church, when I was a Mormon, I spent 10 years as a Mormon. Maybe some of you have looked at my book that is free to read on my website at claregoldsberry.com, called A Stranger in Zion. And I was married in the temple. And you are given a secret name. Names and numbers are very important. And the name, everybody that goes through these secret initiations gets a new name. Well, the Mormons do that as well. They give their people who get married in the temple, they give them a new name that no one is supposed to know. Kind of interesting. I kind of thought it was weird at the time. And you can read about my experiences in the Mormon temple in my book online. And he talks about the circle. You know, Blavatsky has that circle with the dot in it. He said the circle is the symbol of the perfect man, and 7 is the number of the perfect man. So you have the symbol and the number. The number 7 is the perfect man. The logos is the perfect word, that which creates, that which destroys, and that which saves. And so you can see where Jesus learned a lot. And he passes, this little book talks about, he passes through all 7 of these initiations through the secret brotherhood of the Egyptians. And it's really kind of interesting when you look at this and find out how he passes through these different tests of the Hall of Fame, the Hall of Faith, the Hall of the 4th degree is the Hall of Philanthropy. And I really recommend you can get it. It's a new little book. Like I said, I learned about it and ordered it, and it's really fascinating. Now we come to the part where Jesus returns to Jerusalem. He only preached there for 3 years. And a lot of people find that really strange. But I think it goes back to what Jesus said in the New Testament, and that is, let those who have ears hear. Were there really a whole lot of people that were willing to hear what he had to say? It's kind of like, let those who have eyes see. There is none so blind as those who will not see. And so when he taught for 3 years, he was basically preaching and teaching to a group of people who did not like what he had to say. They did not like the idea of that you should love everyone, treat everyone the same way. They didn't like the idea that he ate with tax collectors and prostitutes, that he helped a Samaritan who was injured on the road, because Jews weren't supposed to have anything to do with Samaritans. And so when the Jewish scribes and Pharisees saw the things that Jesus was doing, they didn't like it. So it was these leading people of the temple in Jerusalem, the scribes and the Pharisees and the Sadducees, that wanted Jesus killed. They wanted him killed because he was against their rites and rituals and rules. He didn't believe that there should be 625 rules for people to live by. I mean, we have a hard time remembering to pay our taxes. I mean, much less, got all these rules, 625 rules, and so people, they did not like him. In this little book, Jesus in India, that was published actually in 2003, it was the English edition. The treatise suggests that that after Jesus was crucified, he discreetly left the Roman jurisdiction for the East. Now you say, how did this happen? Well, when Jesus was on the cross, as you may remember, he said, I thirst. And so they lifted up a sponge to him on a stick, and he sucked the contents of that sponge. There is, I would say, a pretty big belief that on that sponge was soma. Soma was an anesthesia that was used in India, by the way. It was used in India, and it actually put people under. It put them like in a coma. So once Jesus was in that coma, the Roman guards there declared that Jesus was dead. Now, there's a doctor that's done a really interesting video on did Jesus really die on the cross? And he said that actually to only have been on the cross such a short time was not enough time for Jesus to have died. One of the reasons they practiced crucifixion back then was it was a very slow, punishing way to die. And so they said Jesus could not have died in 3 days. And so the theory of people who believe he actually did not die on the cross is that he was actually revived, his death shroud rolled up and laid on the table where he was laid, and then was taken out of the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea and taken then to after about 40 days, because remember, the disciples did see Jesus. They saw him in the flesh. Even Thomas is like, well, I don't know if that's really you. Show me your hands and your feet. Let me see the nails, the print of the nails. But, you know, Thomas was really one of Jesus' favorite disciples. And so after about 40 days, they said they saw him ascend. Now, whether or not what they saw, it's obvious Jesus left. And some people, including all these mythologies that now are in India, that are taught by Indians as mythology regarding Jesus' life in India, said that he did come to India. We know that Thomas went to India. Did Thomas go to India with Jesus? Jesus obviously knew the way to India. He probably went with some more traders or merchants and went to India, and probably took Thomas with him. Although there's some stories that say Thomas stayed in Jerusalem for a number of years and then went to India. So the treatise of this book on Jesus in India says that Jesus survived the crucifixion, discreetly left Roman jurisdiction for the East, starting his journey from Jerusalem and passing through Nisibis and Persia. You know, that's the way he came back from India, was through Persia, eventually reaching Afghanistan, where he met the Israelite tribes who had settled there after their escape from the bonds of Nebuchadnezzar centuries before. And, you know, all of this kind of makes sense to me. You know, we always say there's so much about Christianity and the Christian stories and so forth that is just unbelievable, just doesn't make sense. And yet when you connect the stories of people in India and Afghanistan and Persia and these stories that developed, you kind of think, well, you know, maybe, you know, it's possible. It's very possible that he did this. From there, he traveled to Kashmir, where some Israelite tribes had also settled and lived there until his death at an old age. I was going to send over, maybe I'll put that in I'll send Ron the, I should have put it in the paper that I sent over. It's a picture of Jesus's tomb in Srinagar. It's called the Rosabal tomb, and he's not buried above ground. He's buried under the ground and under this house. And he's got there's like a cement image of his footprints showing the nail prints in his footprints. And supposedly he lived in Srinagar in Kashmir, which again might make sense because that's where some of the tribes of Israel had gone. And supposedly he lived until he was about 81 years old and died, and was then buried underneath this house. And that is now his shrine in Srinagar in Kashmir. Other authors have suggested that the resemblance between Buddhist and Christian teachings, between the lives of Jesus and Buddha as recorded in their respective scriptures, indicate that Buddhist teachings must have reached Palestine, been incorporated by Jesus into his own teachings, or that he must have traveled to India pre-crucifixion. So there's kind of the two theories that either Buddhist and Hindu philosophies traveled west into the Middle East and into Palestine, or that Jesus spent time in India when he was younger. The author of this book, Jesus in India, Ghulam Ahmad, asserts that Jesus reached India only after the crucifixion, and that Buddhists later reproduced elements of the Gospels in their scriptures. So there you have another theory, that it was the Buddhists that put Christian elements of Jesus' teachings into their teachings. Blavatsky thinks that Jesus was possibly a reincarnation of Krishna. she talks about that in some of the collected writings that she did. And she mentions Krishna as probably Jesus was a reincarnation of Krishna. He argues that Jesus also preached to Buddhist monks. And this little book, the Aquarian Gospel, does mention that Jesus, as much as Jesus was taught by Buddhist monks, Jesus also taught Buddhist monks, some of whom originally were Jews. So here we have the idea that a lot of these Buddhist monks in northern India were likely Jewish people who accepted him as the manifestation of Buddha, the promised teacher, and mingled his teachings with the Buddhas. So this little book, Jesus in India, also contains claims on the whereabouts of the lost tribes of Israel, suggesting that these tribes were scattered throughout Afghanistan, Kashmir, and Tibet, and provides a list of the tribes of these regions to trace their Israelite roots. So I will send that. I will send the link to this little book so that you can read that. It's really fascinating. It really is. When people often think they know everything about Jesus. Well, there's not much to know. So, but when you read all this stuff, I mean, it's truly amazing. It's truly amazing. And I have lots of other articles and so forth, reports, scientific reports on the genetic affinities of the Jewish populations in India. And one last little thing before we go for questions and discussions is the idea of Thomas. The Apostle Thomas did end up in India. There's a little paper here. It's Apostle Doubting Thomas and India. And I'll send the link to that as well. He was in Kerala, India, which is on the east coast of India, in Mylapore, and he was there for about 40 years. And it says that St. Thomas Christians, they became known as the St. Thomas Christians of India, as they are called. The Apostle Thomas landed in Srinagar in the Kerala coast in AD 52. So it was about 20 years supposedly after Jesus' death that he traveled to India and was martyred in Mylapore near Madras. In other words, St. Thomas was actually killed by Hindu Brahmins in 72 AD. St. Thomas Christians have passed along through the many generations their facts about Thomas. Some of the families claim Thomas baptized their original forebears, and every year they do celebrate the life and death of St. Thomas. There is a St. Thomas Christian missionary mission there, and they talk about the missionaries that were killed by the Hindu Brahmins. Thomas, the doubting one, took the life and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth almost 3,000 miles from Jerusalem to the people of India. He ministered there for 29 years, and then he was martyred there. They think so much of St. Thomas that in this little paper you can see a stamp in 1964, a modern stamp with St. Thomas' name on it illustrates all of India is proud that Thomas was sent to India and carried his Lord with him. And India calls him Saint Thomas. One has to have a stamp on an envelope before it is sent out, like Saint Thomas was sent out. So I think that's pretty interesting. I personally think that Thomas probably followed Jesus to India pretty closely. But I think that's interesting to read because a lot of people don't know about the St. Thomas Christians in India. Because today, obviously, Christians are not allowed to proselytize in India, but everyone is allowed to have their own religion, whatever religion that might be. So that's a really quick lesson here. But I think it's fascinating. And I think if you look at some of these resources, you'll be very fascinated and know that, truth is truth wherever you find it. And you just have to keep digging and keep looking. And certainly Blavatsky had a lot to say about it. So anybody, let's have a discussion. Anybody got any comments, thoughts? Have a discussion?
If you're talking, your microphone is on mute.
Who's talking?
My name's Wayne.
Oh.
I'm new to the group.
Oh.
Just a couple of points. One is, have you ever heard of the book Lamb by Christopher Moore?
I've heard of Christopher Moore. I have not, I tried reading that book one time, and I don't know, someday I'll have to look at it again, but I have, yes.
Oh, I think that is just absolutely mandatory reading in this particular subject area. And I want to explain to the other people, this book Lamb, I would have to say Christopher Moore is writing a story. It's based on, he puts a lot of notes in there in the back of the book, how it's based on all of the stuff that you were talking about. But it's a story.
Right.
And I would call it a mixture of Kurt Vonnegut and Douglas Adams of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, right?
Yeah.
But it is the story written by his best friend, little buddy, that he grew up his whole life.
Yeah.
And they decided to go on this adventure together, right? That Christ was going to go fulfill his purpose in life, and part of this was to go the world.
Right.
And his best friend from his childhood. Let me say this. How can I say this in the most politically correct way? He discovered his purpose in life was to sample the female of the species throughout the entire world, right?
Right.
You've got this funny contrast of Christ was pursuing knowledge, and his buddy was pursuing his pursuits. But it is quite an adventurous story, and it does mix in a lot of the true history.
It does, yeah.
It does refer to at the end of the book. Now, again, I understand you're reading on internet. There's a lot of people sensitive about this book, but I would say that Christopher Moore does not deviate from the Bible in any way, shape, or form as far as Christ. He just creates this story, which I found just hilarious, on top of being, just like Guide to the Galaxy and Kurt Vonnegut, funny, but they got a lot of philosophy in them too.
Yes.
So that was just a suggestion for everybody. It is really quite an adventure.
It is.
And some of it's very wild, like they go to the Middle East not the Middle East, but I don't know, up near Kashmir first, and then to Tibet.
Right. Yeah.
Rather than being a dry story, Christ meets this Yeti in Tibet while he's studying Buddhist meditation, and he Yeti, and wild stories like that. But it is quite an adventure, and so it's not. It's an adventure.
Exactly. Like you said.
Book. Have you read the Priestess Sophia?
The Pistis Sophia? Oh yeah. I've just finished a whole essay on the Pistis Sophia. A friend of mine wrote a book called The Rape of Sophia, about how Sophia's knowledge and wisdom has been absolutely disseminated, just destroyed, decimated by Christianity.
Yeah,
it's really good.
For those who aren't aware, it talks about Christ teaching his, I'll say, disciples, Mary Magdalene being the number one.
Right.
Was it 7-8 years after his crucifixion? And and the Sophia is wisdom,
right?
And how wisdom was decimated. And again, in Christianity and in Judaism, the woman does not play a part of wisdom.
Right. And,
So
that's good. That's a really good book. I think Stephen Heller did the foreword to the book on the Pistis Sophia that I have. Which one do you have? It's
like one by Mead.
By G.R.S. Mead. Yeah, I'll bet that's good. I've got a different one where Stephen Heller actually did the foreword to it. I can't remember who wrote it, and I'm not in my library like you are. You turn around and reach and grab a book.
But it's for those interested, it is an excellent book to give you a different. How do we do it? I can't remember who wrote it, but they said whoever is the conquering Christian, whoever the conquering religion, it destroys every other religion.
Yeah,
That way it makes himself number one. The
yeah,
Romans did it, the Christians did it, the Jews did it, everyone.
yeah,
But this is just, it's another version, and it's not anti-Christian, anti-Jewish. It's just saying this is what he taught,
yeah.
and who he taught it to.
Yeah, mead is really good. I've
Yeah.
got, so GRS Mead was an amazing historian, just amazing. Yeah. Very good. Anybody else
Yeah.
have any comments?
Well, none appearing here. Gosh, it is so good to have you be the person for today's lecture, because we need to have this information. We're all at different points of our learning and discovery, and thank you for
Yeah, yeah,
giving us a little sparkles that we can trace out if
yeah,
we
yeah.
feel like they're important to us. The insights were good. I'd love to have the reference materials so I can pass them around to the folks that
Okay,
attended
I will.
today. Is it okay if I deliver it to non-attendees as well?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
Alright.
Yeah, send it to whoever you want. Send it to everybody.
I do. It's just the way I work. So, Ted, I know you got travels coming up. Please be safe. We need you back here next fall. All right.
Oh,
Wallace,
I plan to travel very unsafe. No, yes, I'm traveling safe.
yeah. You and your sense of humor. How about you, Wallace? Have you got anything for us for prior to Memorial Day or anything like that?
Nothing at this end.
Okay, sir, thank you ever so much. I've got a couple of references I'm gonna dive on right when we get hang up from this thing here. I like the Aquarian Gospel, and I'm gonna do a little bit more work on the life of Saint Issa. So thank you, Claire, very much for what you did for us.
You're very welcome. I will send that all that stuff over to you, Ron, and thank you everybody for attending. I really appreciate you guys.
All right, thank you now.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Yes.